Recommended RAM for video editing. I just got a machine with 32 gigs of RAM and I already regret it. Today's video is brought to you by
Montage.
Clunky Pod. Pod or Pog?
Pog.
Clunky Pog comes in with a question about a graphics card upgrade.
And it is a best GPU you would consider for a 3770. Currently using an RX 570 and play mostly Warzone, single player games, 75Hz, 1080p monitor with 16 gigs of dual channel RAM with a 1TB SSD.
My first off the cuff answer to that is I wouldn't upgrade the graphics card. You could absolutely put a better graphics card in there and get better performance, but you are more CPU limited than you may be aware. Some of those games are older, to be sure. For those of you who don't know or who have forgotten, the i7-3770 is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU as part of the Ivy Bridge platform that launched in 2012. It is 9 years old. I know. During the mid-2010s, Intel was asleep at the wheel and AMD was off in the ditch doing whatever they were doing. But there have legitimately been some real changes since then. The RX 570 is not a bad graphics card.
No, it's pretty good.
It's about the same speed as a 480 or about 10% slower than a 580. It's really not that much slower than a GTX 1060. Yes, a faster graphics card would give more frames per second, but he's running at 1080p, 75 hertz. Exactly. He's got 16 gigs of RAM, 2 gold stars. He's got a terabyte of SSD, 2 gold stars. But to be completely blunt, you need a CPU upgrade, even for those older games. If you were to even go to an i5, I know you have an i7, i5, but if you were to go to an i5 10400 or 11400, 6-core, 12-thread chip, you would have more clock speed, higher instructions per clock cycle,
You would.
DDR4 instead of DDR3,
True.
and 50% more cores.
Yep.
There are reasonably decent pre-builts that he can buy for about $1,000 with a 1660 Super, 16 gigs of RAM,
Yep.
and then, here's an important point, he still has the old machine.
Correct.
That computer right now is probably worth, well, shoot, the video card alone, if it's an 8 gig card.
Well, yeah, because they did 4 gigs.
If it's a 4 gig card, then it's not worth that much. But if it's an 8 gig card, his machine's worth it's probably worth at least $600. Maybe more. The graphics card alone would be worth $500. He could probably sell it and replace it with a new machine for less than he thinks. You've got your answer. But that assumes you have the money and can do that. If not, keep what you've got and save up your money until you can replace it. Today's question comes from Mark, and it concerns the Ryzen 7 3700X 8-core 16-thread Zen 3 CPU, very similar to the CPU in the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. Remember that, it's going to be important. Mark asks, how much of a future do you think the Ryzen 7 3700X has for 1080p gaming? And how good of a match is the Radeon 6750 XT for that CPU for gaming? Well, it depends, asterisk. If you plan to play future AAA games going forward over the next 5 years, no. It is absolutely going to run into the brick wall of IPC per core performance and total core count over the next 5 years for future AAA big budget games. Should it? Probably not, but it will. Mark my words on that. However, do not misinterpret that sentence. That does not mean, Tech's saying my 3700X is obsolete. He thinks 8 cores is over for gaming. He thinks if you don't have 16 cores, you're just crap. That's nonsense. Here's what I said. The Ryzen 7 3700X will not last 5 years for future AAA games coming out over the next 5 years. It will play many of them. It will not play all of them. I do firmly believe that you will find titles that run like hot dog meat on that CPU before 5 years is out. even if you lower the detail settings. However, those very well may be the exception and not the rule. And here's where nuance comes into play. You can absolutely positively use a Ryzen 7 3700X for the next 5 years. The vast majority of people watching this video could absolutely be perfectly happy with a Ryzen 7 3700X beyond the next 5 years. Some of you watching this video could use that for the next 10 years. I don't recommend it. You really should upgrade more often than every 10 years, but you could. You can move from a 3700X to a 5700X. Now, why would I want to do that, you ask? My chip's currently fine. Yes, it is. It is fine. A 5700X is not going to run a game that your 3700X will not. There is nothing in the world now or in the future that a 3700X will just go, nope, I'm not doing it, but a 5700X will go, yep, I'm doing it. However, a 5700X is 20% faster on a per core basis than a 3700X, and the 5700X is a unified 8-core chiplet. It's 8 cores meshed together. There's no infinity fabric putting them together. A 3700X is 2 4-core chips. This will age more poorly than the 5700X because any game or program that uses more than 4 cores has to pass all of its data back and forth across the infinity fabric. It's not the end of the world, but it does introduce delays and latency. It gives you worse 1% lows. It gives you worse overall feel in the game, even if the actual frame rate counter isn't dramatically different. But then there is that 20% performance boost. For the cost of a couple of pizzas, you can go ahead and replace that 3700X today and have the Zen 3 chip with the unified cache. Along with those chiplets, there's another benefit. There's 32 megabytes of cache on both chips, but the 32 megabytes of cache is unified and usable by all the cores on the 5700X. As games and datasets get bigger, on the 3700X, you have two 16 megabyte L3 caches, and if these 4 cores want to access all the cache, they have to go through the Infinity Fabric to do it. Not the end of the world, but it does introduce latency, which is what creates stutters, which is what makes your game feel slower than whatever the frame rate counter on the screen actually is. At current prices, if you can afford to watch this video, and if you can afford to ask the question about what kind of Zen 2, Zen 3 CPU should I have, at least do that upgrade. Junior, how much RAM do you have in your computer at home?
32.
How much RAM do you have in your computer at the office?
64.
Is 64 more than 32?
Yes.
Depending upon what you're doing with video editing, I mean, 32 is actually enough for some people for video editing. It depends on how complex it is. The more complex the edits and the programs you're using, of course, it also depends on what program you're using. If you're using Windows Movie Maker, obviously you need less RAM than if you're using Adobe Premiere Pro, which is known to be a memory hog. You just launch that thing and it's using 10 gigs of RAM without even doing anything. And if you get into like Adobe After Effects, I've not done a lot with Adobe After Effects, but I've seen Adobe After Effects and Premiere Pro combined use about 80 gigs of RAM on a big project.
Why, you don't have 80 gigs of RAM?
Well, you're not using Adobe After Effects now, are you?
No.
So there you go. So more is better. And any extra RAM you have works as a disk cache and buffers frequently access data. So if you can afford more, get more.
Fast RAM is fast.
And more RAM is fast. Johnny number 5 comes in with an awesome question about CPU upgrades.
And it is, he's running the 9900K with a 3080 and at 1440p, but he feels like his CPU is holding back that 3080, and he wants to know when is the motherboard swap and CPU upgrade worth it, in our opinion?
Well, this is actually a great question, and I suspect way too many people will either roll their eyes or prejudge it, or they will have already gone to the comment section to leave a comment without listening to what I have to say.
Oh, you mean without watching the video? No, that never happens.
That happens way too often.
So don't be that person.
I award 0 gold stars to anybody who leaves a comment before they watch the video. Now, first of all, let me get a point out right up front. The i9-9900K is an awesome CPU. I have benchmarked it endlessly on our channel. I have tested it with like every graphics card you can imagine. I have an i9-9900K at home. I have a ton of experience with that CPU. And it's interesting you asked the question because about a year ago, I upgraded from its predecessor, the i7-8700K. Now, for those of you who maybe have forgotten or weren't paying attention at the time, it happens, I understand. The i7-8700K was, at the time, the top-end consumer chip from Intel, 6-core, 12-thread, roughly equivalent to a Ryzen 5 3600X, if it's not overclocked, and a little bit better if it is. 4.3 gigahertz all-core, but it would run at 5 gigahertz if you wanted it to, with sufficient cooling. The i9-9900K is an 8-core, 16-thread chip with a 4.7 gigahertz out-of-the-box all-core turbo. MCE easily does 5 gigahertz with a reasonably decent cooler. The current debate among gamers that I see is 6 cores or 8 cores. 12 or 16 seems to be relegated mostly to content creators, heavy multitaskers, live streamers who want to use one computer and whatnot. Most people online go to Reddit, go to Twitter, go to Discords. They all seem to think, well, do you get a 6-core or do you get an 8-core? Most people agree that 4 cores are now relegated to basic entry-level stuff for older machines. Those certainly are yesterday's news. Here's the funny thing. He's not crazy to ask this question, and I'm sure plenty of people say, what? 9900K? How dare you even think of upgrading it? That is outrageous. An i9-9900, yes, I'll get to the point. An i9-9900K is better than a lot of our viewers have.
It is.
It is a better CPU. There's a ton of people watching who have an FX 8300 or a Ryzen 5 1600 or maybe a Ryzen 7 2700. A 9900K is better than all of those in every respect. Faster per core, more cores, everything, higher clock speed, etc. He has a 3080 and he's running at 1080p.
No, 1440.
I'm sorry, thank you. I was thinking as opposed to 4K, but you're right. He's running at 1440p. There will be situations, not many, but they do exist, where even at 1440p, he will be CPU bottlenecked. But it's rare. I have a 9900K at home, and I am actually looking at replacing that with a Ryzen 9 5950X, 16-core, 32-thread chip. But wait, Tech, I can already hear you go into the comment section. You're a content creator. You make 4K YouTube videos. Well, of course, you want a faster machine. I have a 24-core Threadripper. I've got an 18-core Cascade Lake X. My work machines are high-end desktop professional machines with all very nice stuff in them, 128 gigs of RAM in the works. This is my personal gaming machine at home. I don't make videos on it. I find 8 cores is very much starting to become a limitation. And the game that shows that limitation the most is...
Cyberpunk.
Cyberpunk.
But you also multitask more than the average person too. So between multitasking and playing a game, it's kind of like...
Cyberpunk runs fine on a 9900K if that's all you're doing. Either a single monitor situation, or if you have 2 monitors, you minimize and close whatever's on the other monitor and you just play your game. And that's fine. And if you do that, I do that, it works pretty well. In older games, I could certainly have my other monitor watching a Twitch stream, watching a YouTube video. I could be occasionally chatting in Discord or chatting on a forum or chatting on Twitter while I'm doing stuff. In Cyberpunk, if I have the web browsers open, if I'm doing something while I'm playing, the difference in frame stutter, the difference in smoothness is absolutely... I don't need benchmarks to tell the difference. It is very clear that the CPU is tasked to capacity. Now, I also have other things running on my machine because I have backups and syncs and I have a lot of files and a lot of storage and whatnot. And it definitely is, shall we say, an above average tasked machine. It is not my work machine.
No, so his question is, what is next after
I'm getting there. This is the tech version of the answer. So, most people watching me right now, if you have an i9 9900K and an RTX 3080, I would not advise you upgrade. It is a great CPU. It's a great GPU. You already have it. It's already working. Enjoy it. You do not want to touch it until Alder Lake comes out this fall on LGA 1700. We're about to get a whole new socket with a new chipset, a new everything with Big Little. And Intel will be going to 16 cores and 24 threads on the desktop. And then early next year in 2022, Zen 5 is launching, 5 nanometer, new socket with the Zen 5. Did I say Zen 5? AM5.
AM5.
With Zen 4.
Zen 4.
My apologies. There's so many numbers, and it's if my brain can get tangled thinking, okay, AM5, Zen 4, DDR5, PCI Express 4. How does the average person who doesn't do this for a living keep any of that straight?
And then there's going to be DDR4 and DDR5 in there as well.
Alder Lake is going to support both. Oh, and Alder Lake on the Intel side will support PCI Express Gen 5, but not for the M.2 slots. So yeah, it's going to be interesting, folks. I would keep a 9900K for another year or two. It really is fine.
He says, what would you do with the Threadripper 1950X that's acting funny? It's refusing to boot unless you repeat RAM or GPU running at 1x.
Send it to bed without multitasking? Not that kind of acting funny. On a serious note, the first generation Ryzen chips could be fussy.
They were fussy.
I have a 1950X, and it was fine, but it went through a long series of teething troubles and a lot of part changes and adjustments before it finally became...
RAM was fussy too, wasn't it?
Oh, RAM was just atrocious.
So I'm wondering if RAM might be an issue.
RAM might be definitely an issue, and he even mentioned unless he repeats
Exactly.
RAM settings or GPU settings.
Exactly.
BIOS updates.
Yep.
I have a X399 Asus ROG Strix-E Threadripper board on a 1950X, and between many BIOS updates and many swaps of RAM, I currently ended up with Flare X RAM from G-Skill in there, and that was some of the only RAM that was reliable.
It's running stable right now, but it took a lot to get there.
Yeah. Honestly, do you know what I would do with it? Replace it with not Threadripper.
Sell it.
Yeah. The first generation Threadrippers are fussy. If you want to change the RAM and if you want to update your BIOS, another thing you might consider doing, and this is something I bet a lot of people don't do with their BIOS. I've done it a couple of times, and it has solved problems, especially when you brick the board. Flash the older BIOS versions and then reflash the new version.
Yeah, we had to do that.
You shouldn't ever have to do that. Reverting to an old version of the BIOS, well, that's ridiculous. Who would ever do that? Well, I have had a couple of cases with Ryzen. Not that particular board, but with Ryzen, especially the first generation boards, where you would flash to the newest version and it wouldn't work. Sometimes it bricked the board, sometimes it would boot, but it would never be stable, or it wouldn't detect the RAM, or you couldn't turn on XMP, or you'd have weird problems. We had a Gigabyte X370 K7 board, a very $229 board, premium high-end board, Gigabyte X370 K7 board, that we ended up using the BIOS flashback to go all the way back to the launch BIOS.
We did.
And then I didn't do every BIOS, but I skipped like every third BIOS. And I did like 8 BIOS flashes, one after the other, booting it up, making sure it worked. And then I would go just like 3 BIOSes and then 3 more. And I worked my way from the original. It took like 4 hours to go from the original BIOS to the new BIOS. And once I finally did, the board worked fine. Fussy as heck. Borderlands 3 is a much newer game with heavier graphics. However, it still does quite well. This is 1080p ultra detail, and our average frame rate holds just above 60. It's not ideal. There will be stutter in this game. It's at least, however, functional. We also tested it at very low detail to see if that made much of a difference. However, it did not. We averaged 84. It's not much faster because we are CPU bound here, not GPU. The 1% load did improve, so that's something to consider. Lowering detail settings isn't always about average frame rate. It definitely can help with 1% lows in some cases. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 is next. This game really is CPU bottlenecked even at ultra detail. This is the built-in benchmark because we tested 22 games and doing live gameplay on Call of Duty properly takes 4 hours to do 2 detail settings on a single setup due to multiple matches required to find the baseline. Expect live gameplay in multiplayer to vary up and down from this, with a 1% low that gets worse the bigger the map and the match. This game is pretty well optimized for a wide range of hardware, but it really does want more than 4 threads for a great experience. Fortnite is next, and instead of side by side, we're going to show you 2 battles at different detail settings. This is ultra detail, and as you can see, it runs terribly. Frame stutters, input lag, and a 1% low that will dip to single digits at times. This isn't a graphics card problem, it is a lack of CPU power to draw the detail of the world. This is low detail, and to be fair, it's not the same game mode, our bad, so it's not a one-to-one comparable. However, it should give you a general idea of what to expect. The performance difference is night and day better. It's not perfect, but that's not a reasonable expectation on this PC. Instead, what this does show is that if you want to play games like Fortnite, you absolutely can with some compromises.